Story begins on an ordinary winter evening in a large city where people from many backgrounds cross paths without noticing each other. And in this setting, a small restaurant near an old concert hall stayed busy with late guests who talked softly and ate warm food after long days. And among the staff was a young waitress named Alina who moved quietly between tables with calm focus. And she had grown up far from this place in a modest town where music was part of daily life because her mother played. At home after work and her father fixed broken instruments for neighbors, and from a young age Alina listened more than she spoke. And she learned melodies by memory rather than lessons, and life later pushed her into working long hours to support herself after her parents passed away. And music became something she kept private, like a memory she did not share. And on that same evening, a world-known billionaire named Victor Hale arrived in the city for a charity event linked to classical music and education, and he was known for his sharp mind and demanding nature, and for sponsoring competitions that challenged even the best musicians. And earlier that day, during a private gathering at the concert hall, Victor had presented a mysterious piano tune that he claimed was found in an old notebook with no clear composer, and he invited 20 well-known experts to identify and complete the tune, and none of them succeeded despite hours of effort. And Victor left the hall frustrated but curious, decided to eat nearby with a few guests, and this is how fate guided him to the small restaurant where Alina worked. And when Victor sat down, he carried the weight of disappointment and pride, and he spoke about the failed challenge with mild irritation. And Alina overheard parts of the conversation while serving water and bread, and something about the tune description caught her attention because it sounded like a pattern her mother once played late at night. And while she tried to ignore it, the melody formed clear. Her mind and her hands almost moved on their own, as if touching invisible keys, and she felt a mix of excitement and fear because she knew her place and knew she was only a waitress in this setting, and people like Victor rarely noticed people like her. And yet the music inside her felt urgent and real. And when Victor asked the restaurant owner if there was a piano nearby for his guests, the owner pointed to an old upright piano in the corner that was mostly decorative and rarely tuned, and Victor walked toward it, still thinking about the failed experts, and spoke aloud about how strange it was that knowledge sometimes failed where intuition might succeed. And those words stayed with Alina. And as Victor touched the keys, he played the incomplete tune slowly and stopped shaking his head, and the sound filled the room with curiosity and silence. And without planning to, Alina found herself stepping closer with a polite apology. And she said softly that she thought she knew how the tune continued, and the room froze for a moment. And Victor turned surprised and measured her from head to toe. And some guests smiled politely while others doubted her, and Alina felt her heart race. But she stood firm because the melody felt like truth to her. And Victor allowed her a moment more out of interest than belief, and Alina sat at the piano taking a breath and letting her memory guide her. And as she placed her fingers down, she felt the years of quiet listening return, and the tune flowed naturally without effort, and the missing parts connected with balance and emotion. And the room changed as people leaned in, and Victor stood still listening closely. And in that minute, something rare happened as class and status disappeared and only sound mattered. And when Alina finished the final note, she pulled her hands back, unsure of what would follow, and the silence was deep and honest, and Victor broke it by asking her where she learned that tune, and Alina answered simply that she learned it at home long ago without knowing its name. And Victor looked both amazed and thoughtful, because in all his years of collecting talent, he had overlooked the power of hidden lives. And this moment marked the beginning of a story that would change both of them and remind others that wisdom does not always wear a title or sit on a stage, and that sometimes truth waits quietly until someone is willing to listen. And if any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without them, Victor remained seated for a long moment after the last sound faded, and the room slowly returned to its earlier noise. Yet something had clearly shifted inside him, and he asked Alina to sit across from him, not with authority but with genuine interest. And she hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron before agreeing. And when she sat, she kept her posture careful, as if afraid to take too much space, and Victor noticed this immediately. And it reminded him how often power made others shrink without words, and he began asking her gentle questions about where she learned to play and how she remembered melodies so clearly. And Alina explained that in her childhood, her mother played the piano every evening after work, not to perform, but to rest her mind, and Alina would sit nearby doing homework, listening without trying to learn. And over time, the music settled into her memory like a second language. And she said her father repaired instruments and sometimes brought broken pianos home, and she would test the keys while he worked, learning how sound changed with pressure and patience. And Victor listened without interrupting, something he rarely did in meetings, and he felt an unfamiliar respect forming because her knowledge came from lived moments, not institutions. And as she spoke, he saw no desire to impress, only honesty, and that sincerity made her words stronger than rehearsed answers. And Victor asked if she ever considered a career in music, and Alina smiled faintly, saying life required practical choices. And after her parents passed away, she needed steady work, and music became something private that helped her remember them. And Victor felt a tightening in his chest because he had spent decades funding programs, yet never asked how many people were lost to circumstance before reaching a stage. And he realized his competitions rewarded those who already had access and time and guidance, and Alina represented a different truth, that talent could exist quietly without validation. And the guests nearby noticed the intensity of their conversation, but did not interrupt, and the restaurant owner watched nervously, unsure. Boundary was crossed, yet Victor reassured him with a nod. and then told Alina about the tune, explaining it came from a fragile notebook found in an estate sale and experts believed it incomplete or experimental, and none could resolve it. And when Alina explained how the pattern felt familiar and resolved itself naturally, Victor felt humbled because the answer was not missing notes but missing perspective. And he admitted this aloud, surprising even himself, and Alina looked at him with curiosity, because she did not expect such openness from someone of his reputation. And Victor then invited her to visit the concert hall the following morning, not to perform, but to talk and listen and perhaps play again if she wished. And Alina felt fear and excitement mix, because such places represented worlds she never entered, yet she agreed, sensing this invitation carried sincerity. And when she returned to work, her steps felt lighter, yet her thoughts raced, and that night she lay awake replaying the melody and the conversation, wondering if she had stepped into something larger than herself. And Victor, in his hotel room, looked out at the city lights, realizing for the first time that his success had filtered his view. And he resolved to slow down and listen more closely, starting with the young waitress who reminded him that meaning often waits outside the spotlight. And this understanding quietly reshaped the path ahead for both of them. And if any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. The next morning arrived with a quiet tension for Alina, as she prepared for work earlier than usual and chose simple clothes that made her feel steady rather than noticeable. And while the city moved through its normal rhythm, she felt as if she were stepping into unfamiliar territory. And when her shift ended, she stood outside the restaurant for a long moment, breathing deeply before walking toward the concert hall Victor mentioned. And the building itself felt imposing, with tall stone walls and wide steps that carried the weight of history and achievement. And Alina hesitated at the entrance, unsure if she truly belonged there, but a staff member greeted her by name as if she were expected and guided her inside. And this small act eased her nerves slightly. And inside the hall the air felt different, filled with a quiet respect for sound and silence, and Victor was already waiting, dressed simply without the formality she expected. And he greeted her warmly, thanking her for coming and leading her through empty corridors where echoes followed their footsteps. And as they walked, Victor spoke openly about his past, explaining how he built his success through discipline, competition, and constant proof of worth. And he admitted that over time this approach narrowed his view and made him trust systems more than people. And Alina listened carefully, not interrupting, because she understood the value of being heard. And when they reached a smaller practice room, Victor invited her to sit at a grand piano that gleamed under soft light, and Alina felt intimidated by the instrument because she was used to worn keys and imperfect sound. Yet when she touched the keys, she was surprised by their warmth and responsiveness, and Victor asked her to play anything she wished without pressure. And Alina closed her eyes and chose a simple melody her mother once played during rainy evenings, and the notes filled the room gently, without performance energy, but with sincerity. And Victor stood quietly listening, noticing how her hands moved with intention rather than habit, and how she adjusted touch instinctively. And when she finished, Victor did not speak immediately. Instead, he asked how she decided which notes to play, and Alina explained that she followed emotion rather than rules, and that mistakes were part of understanding, not failure. And this answer struck Victor deeply, because his world punished mistakes and rewarded perfection. And he realized that this fear of error limited creativity and learning. And he asked if she would be willing to spend time exploring the mysterious tune further, not challenge but as a conversation. And Alina agreed cautiously, because she did not want to be turned into an example or spectacle. And Victor respected this boundary, assuring her that her comfort mattered. And over the next hours they worked quietly, testing variations, listening more than correcting. And Victor invited a few trusted musicians to observe, not to judge. And Alina noticed how differently the room felt without competition. And some musicians admitted they felt freer to experiment, and Victor watched this shift with growing awareness that leadership could invite rather than demand. And by the afternoon, Alina felt mentally exhausted but emotionally full. And Victor offered to arrange flexible lessons or support without obligations, and Alina felt overwhelmed by the generosity, but also wary because help often came with conditions. And Victor sensed this, and clarified that she owed him nothing and that he was learning as much as she was, and this honesty built trust slowly. And as Alina left the hall, she felt a new sense of possibility, not fame or escape, but permission to value her own voice. And Victor returned to his office, reviewing past projects with fresh eyes, questioning how many people were excluded by design. And he began drafting ideas for programs focused on access and listening rather than competition. And this day marked a quiet turning point where both learned that true progress often begins when certainty is replaced with curiosity, and power learns to step back and listen. And if any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. In the weeks that followed, Alina continued her regular shifts at the restaurant while visiting the concert hall a few times each week. And this balance kept her grounded, because she did not want her life to flip suddenly into something unrecognizable. And Victor respected this choice even when advisors suggested moving faster and making announcements, and he explained to them that trust could not be rushed, and that Alina was not a project person. And this approach confused some people around him who were used to clear timelines and outcomes, yet Victor remained firm, because he felt a responsibility to protect the quiet honesty that had brought them together. And during these visits, Alina spent time not only at the piano but also listening to rehearsals and observing how musicians interacted. And she noticed tension in some rooms where competition still lived beneath polite language. And she also noticed moments of generosity where musicians shared ideas freely. And these observations helped her understand that talent alone did not shape environments, but attitudes did, and Victor often asked her what she noticed, and he listened carefully to her answers without correcting them. And over time, Alina became more confident expressing her thoughts because she saw they were valued and not tested. And one afternoon, Victor invited her to sit in on a planning meeting with senior staff who managed educational programs, and Alina felt nervous because she had never been in such a setting and worried her presence might be questioned. And Victor introduced her simply as someone whose perspective mattered, and did not explain further, and this gesture removed pressure to justify herself. And as the meeting progressed, discussions centered on budgets, outreach, and metrics, and Alina listened quietly until Victor asked her what she thought. And after a pause, she spoke honestly, saying that many people never entered these spaces because they assumed they were not meant for them, and that music education often reached those already close to opportunity. And the room grew still because her words were simple but direct, and some staff felt defensive, while others thoughtful, and Victor did not step in to soften her message. And this allowed a real conversation to begin. And some shared experiences of failed outreach efforts, and others admitted fear of changing established models, and Alina listened and realized how difficult institutional change could be even with good intentions, and this understanding deepened her respect for Victor because she saw he was willing to face discomfort rather than protect image. And after the meeting, Victor thanked her privately for speaking honestly, and Alina admitted it was difficult but necessary, and Victor agreed, saying leadership often required inviting truths that challenged comfort. And outside the hall, Alina still faced her own challenges because rumors began circulating at the restaurant about her visits, and some coworkers reacted with curiosity while others with distance, and a few suggested she was trying to escape her role, and these comments hurt because Alina valued her work and did not see it as lesser. And she shared these feelings with Victor, who listened and reminded her that growth often unsettled familiar dynamics, and that she did not owe anyone an explanation for learning. And still, Alina took time to reflect on who she was becoming and whether she could hold multiple identities without losing herself in one. Evening, after a long shift, she sat alone at the old upright piano in the restaurant and played softly. And this familiar space reminded her that her relationship with music did not depend on approval or opportunity. And this grounding helped her return to the concert hall with steadiness rather than expectation. And meanwhile, Victor began facing pushback from donors who questioned why resources were being redirected toward exploratory programs without clear competitive outcomes, and Victor responded by sharing stories rather than statistics, and spoke about unseen potential and the cost of exclusion, and some donors listened, while others withdrew support, and Victor accepted this, knowing change required sacrifice. And he confided in Alina that this was one of the hardest parts because it meant letting go of certainty and prestige, and Alina responded that she had lived with uncertainty her whole life, and that meaning often grew there, and this perspective helped Victor reframe loss as transition. And as months passed, small pilot programs launched quietly, offering open access sessions in community spaces without auditions or rankings, and Alina sometimes attended not as a teacher, but as a participant and listener. And she saw people of all ages engage with music freely, and some rediscovered joy while others found confidence. And these moments confirmed that the path Victor was choosing mattered beyond recognition. And Alina felt pride not because she was at the center, but because she witnessed something humane unfolding, and Victor observed her growth not in technical skill, but in voice and presence. And he realized that the original tune that brought them together had been a doorway, not a destination. And that the real work was learning to listen across differences without hierarchy. And this realization reshaped how he viewed success and legacy. And for Alina, the journey clarified that her value was not defined by titles or stages, but by authenticity and connection, and this shared understanding continued to guide them through uncertainty as they built something slower but more lasting together. And if any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. As the quiet programs expanded, Alina found herself gradually invited into conversations as a collaborator rather than an example. And this shift felt meaningful because it showed genuine trust. And she began helping design informal music sessions in neighborhoods far from concert halls where people gathered after work or school, and these spaces were imperfect and sometimes noisy yet full of sincerity, and Alina felt at ease there because they reminded her of her childhood home where music existed without pressure. And Victor often attended quietly, sitting among participants, listening rather than directing, and he noticed how people opened up when they were not being evaluated, and how confidence grew through shared experience rather than praise, and these observations reinforced his belief that his earlier models had missed something essential. And as word spread about these sessions, media interest slowly followed, and journalists asked to frame Alina as a discovery or a miracle. But she resisted such labels because they simplified her journey, and Victor supported her refusal even when publicity could have attracted funding. And instead, he suggested telling broader stories about access and community. And this choice frustrated some advisors, yet it protected the integrity of the work. And during this time, Alina faced an internal struggle because opportunities were now available that once felt impossible, and she worried about losing the simplicity that grounded her. And she spoke openly with Victor about this fear. And he admitted he shared it because change often demanded parts of the past be released. And together they agreed to move carefully, choosing depth over speed. And one evening after a community session, an older participant thanked Alina, saying the music reminded him he was still capable of learning. And this moment affected her deeply because it showed impact. beyond skill or recognition, and she realized her role was not to become something else, but to help others feel permission to explore. And Victor witnessed this exchange and felt a quiet confirmation that the path he chose mattered more than any accolade, and both understood that the original piano tune had simply revealed a truth that was waiting to be lived rather than solved. As time passed, the mysterious piano tune that first connected Alina and Victor began to take on new meaning, not as a puzzle to be claimed but as a shared language that evolved with each person who touched it. And Victor suggested documenting its variations, not to publish a final version, but to show how interpretation changed across backgrounds. And Alina liked this idea because it honored diversity rather than authority, and small workshops were organized where participants were invited to listen to the original fragment and respond freely, and some added rhythm, others slowed it down, and a few chose silence before playing. And these differences were welcomed and discussed, and Alina facilitated, gently asking what people felt rather than what they intended. And Victor observed how this approach reduced fear and encouraged honesty, and he began applying similar listening practices in his business meetings, asking fewer leading questions and allowing pauses. And this shift surprised colleagues, yet gradually improved trust and collaboration. And Alina noticed changes in herself as well, because she became more comfortable speaking in varied settings and learned that her voice carried weight even without credentials. And she still worked part-time at the restaurant by choice because it kept her connected to daily life and reminded her that dignity existed in all work. And some regular customers recognized her and asked about the music sessions, and she invited them without expectation. And this blending of worlds felt natural to her. And one night after closing, she played the tune again on the old upright piano and realized it no longer belonged single memory or moment, but carried layers of shared experience. And she smiled quietly, understanding that growth did not mean leaving her past behind, but allowing it to expand. And Victor later reflected that the greatest lesson he learned was not about music, but about humility, and he acknowledged publicly that progress came from listening to those outside traditional power. And this admission marked a lasting change in how he chose to lead and support others. And together they continued building spaces where curiosity replaced judgment, and where unfinished ideas were treated as invitations rather than failures. And if any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. As the initiative continued into its second year, Alina and Victor both faced moments that tested the values they had slowly built. And these challenges did not arrive as dramatic conflicts, but as steady pressure from systems that preferred clear hierarchies and predictable outcomes. And for Victor, this pressure intensified when a major international foundation offered substantial funding on the condition that the programs be restructured into a formal academy with auditions, rankings, and a public face that highlighted exceptional individuals. And the proposal promised stability and prestige, and many advisors urged Victor to accept, arguing that influence could later be used to soften the structure from within. And Victor found himself deeply conflicted, because part of him recognized the familiar logic of compromise, while another part remembered the quiet rooms where people played freely without fear. And he brought this dilemma to Alina, not asking for advice, but for perspective. And Alina listened, carefully understanding the weight of the decision. And she spoke slowly, saying that structures always taught people how to behave, and that if fear was built into the entrance, it would shape everything that followed. And she acknowledged that resources mattered, but questioned what would be lost in the process. And her words did not push Victor toward a clear answer, but clarified the cost of convenience. And Victor spent many nights reflecting on his own history, remembering how often he had chosen efficiency over humanity and how those choices narrowed his world. And in the end, he declined the offer, politely explaining that the work needed to remain open and adaptable, even if that meant slower growth. And this decision led to criticism in industry circles, and some labeled him unrealistic or sentimental. Yet Victor felt a sense of alignment he had not experienced in years, and Alina supported him quietly, recognizing that leadership sometimes meant standing alone. And around the same time, Alina faced her own turning point when she was offered a position to study formally at a respected conservatory with financial support and flexible terms. And this opportunity stirred mixed emotions, because while it represented validation and growth, it also carried expectations that conflicted with her intuitive approach. And she feared being reshaped into something that did not feel true. And she shared these concerns with participants in the community sessions, who responded with encouragement rather than pressure. And one person told her that learning did not erase origin, and that she could choose what to carry forward. And this collective trust helped Alina decide to accept the offer on her own terms, committing to learn technique while preserving her relationship with sound. And she made it clear that she would continue the community work, and Victor supported this balance, ensuring the programs adjusted around her schedule rather than replacing her presence. And as Alina entered the conservatory, she encountered environments very different from the ones she helped create, where comparison was common and mistakes were often hidden. And at first she felt out of place. But over time she began asking questions that disrupted assumptions, such as why certain interpretations were valued over others, and how emotion was measured. And some instructors resisted while others engaged, and a few students found relief in her openness and began sharing their own doubts. And Alina realized that change could happen quietly, even within rigid systems. And Victor observed this evolution with admiration, recognizing that Alina was not rejecting tradition, but expanding it. And he continued to advocate for programs that valued process over product, even when results were harder to quantify, and gradually, some institutions began adopting similar models, citing improved engagement and retention. And while these shifts were modest, they signaled movement, and Alina noticed that the original tune now served as a teaching tool, not to demonstrate mastery but to explore interpretation, and she saw students and participants approach it differently based on culture, memory, and mood. And this diversity reinforced the belief that meaning was not fixed. And Victor documented these stories not as data points but as narratives, and shared them in talks, emphasizing that progress emerged when people were trusted and listened to. And over time, the story of the Waitress and the Billionaire faded from public focus, replaced by the work itself, and both Alina and Victor welcomed this because it meant the spotlight had shifted from individuals to values. And in quieter moments, they reflected on how far they had come, not in status, but in understanding, and they acknowledged that the journey was ongoing and uncertain, yet grounded in respect. And this phase marked a deeper maturity, where early excitement gave way to sustained commitment, and where choices were guided less by possibility and more by responsibility. And through these choices, both learned that real change was not defined by a single moment of amazement, but by the daily willingness to protect spaces where people could listen to themselves and each other without fear. And if any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. As the work matured, its effects began appearing in unexpected places far beyond the original community rooms and concert hall corridors. And this phase unfolded quietly, without announcements or ceremonies, which suited Alina and Victor because they had both grown wary of attention that arrived before understanding. And one of the most noticeable changes was in the people who participated repeatedly, because their relationship with music shifted from performance toward presence. And Alina observed that many no longer asked whether they were good enough, and instead asked what they felt or noticed. And this subtle change carried into other areas of their lives, and some spoke about listening differently at home, at work, or with friends. And Victor collected these reflections not to measure success, understand influence, and he noticed that the language people used became less about achievement and more about connection. And this affirmed his belief that cultural change often began with shifts in vocabulary and perception, rather than policy and funding. And Alina, meanwhile, navigated the dual worlds of the conservatory and community work with growing clarity. And while formal training challenged her, it also gave her tools to articulate instincts she once kept private, and she learned to translate between technical language and lived experience, which made her a bridge rather than an outlier. And some instructors who initially doubted her approach began inviting her to co-lead discussions because students responded to her openness. And this recognition did not inflate her sense of self, but deepened her responsibility to remain grounded. And she continued returning to the restaurant regularly, not because she needed the income, but because it reminded her where she started and kept her connected. People who knew her simply as Alina and not as a symbol. And some evenings, customers asked her about the music programs, and she answered honestly without embellishment, and invited them to attend if they were curious. And Victor noticed how naturally she carried these conversations without persuasion or defensiveness, and he reflected on how credibility built slowly through consistency rather than branding. And during this time, Victor faced a health scare that forced him to slow down unexpectedly, and while the issue resolved without lasting damage, it shifted his priorities further. And he delegated more authority to teams he trusted and encouraged them to make decisions without seeking constant approval. And this decentralization mirrored the values Alina championed, and led to more responsive and humane leadership structures. And Alina supported Victor during this period, not with advice but with presence, and she reminded him that stepping back did not mean losing relevance, and this reassurance mattered because it echoed the same lesson they shared with others, that worth was not tied to constant output. And as Victor recovered, he spent more time attending sessions without speaking, simply listening. And he noticed that people no longer adjusted their behavior when he entered the room, and this signaled trust and equality. And he considered this one of the most meaningful outcomes of the work. And Alina too experienced moments of doubt, especially when balancing expectations from different worlds felt heavy. And during one such moment, she revisited her childhood town and sat at the old piano her father once repaired. And though the keys were uneven, the sound felt familiar and grounding. And she realized that the essence of her relationship with music had not changed, only its reach. And she returned with renewed clarity that growth did not require abandoning origin. And as the years progressed, some participants began leading sessions themselves, adapting the model to their own contexts. And Alina encouraged this autonomy because she believed sustainability depended on shared ownership, and Victor supported this by shifting resources toward training facilitators rather than central programming, and this reduced reliance on him and ensured continuity beyond his involvement. And when journalists occasionally returned seeking a dramatic narrative, Victor declined interviews and suggested they speak with participants instead. And this choice redirected attention toward collective experience. And over time, the story lost its novelty, but gained depth. And Alina found satisfaction in this because it meant the work had moved beyond her. And Victor had grown comfortable with this anonymity, as well, recognizing that legacy was strongest when it no longer needed protection. And one evening during a small gathering, Alina played the original tune once more, but this time she invited others to join, adding sounds, voices, and pauses. And the result was imperfect and alive, and Victor listened, recognizing that the amazement he once felt had evolved into something steadier and more enduring. And he understood that the true resolution of the tune was not a final arrangement, but the relationships it had shaped. And this realization confirmed that the journey they shared had moved from chance encounter to sustained practice, and that its impact would continue quietly through people who might never know its origin. And this understanding brought a sense of peace and continuity to both of them as they looked toward an open future guided not by certainty, but by trust and listening. And if any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. As the years moved forward, the work that Alina and Victor helped nurture settled into a rhythm that no longer depended on their constant presence. And this shift marked an important phase because it revealed whether the values they protected could live on their own. And Alina noticed that in many sessions people referenced listening, curiosity, and patience without knowing where those ideas originated, and this pleased her because it meant the principles had been absorbed rather than performed. And she increasingly stepped back, allowing others to facilitate discussions and shape sessions in ways that reflected their own communities. And some groups met in libraries, others in small cafes, and a few gathered outdoors where sound mixed with city noise and nature. And these variations reinforced the belief that music did not require ideal conditions to be meaningful. And Victor observed this decentralization with a mix of pride and humility because it confirmed that his role had shifted from founder to supporter, and he focused his energy on removing barriers quietly rather than guiding direction. And this involved negotiating with institutions to allow flexible use of spaces, sharing resources across programs, and encouraging partnerships that did not demand ownership. And while these efforts lacked visibility, they strengthened resilience, and Alina meanwhile completed her formal studies, not with top honors or public accolades, but with a reputation for thoughtful engagement and collaboration. And some peers sought her out for guidance not on technique, but on sustaining motivation and authenticity in demanding environments. And she shared honestly that uncertainty never fully disappeared, and that the goal was not confidence but commitment, and this perspective resonated with those who felt overwhelmed by comparison and expectation. And after graduating, Alina declined several offers that would have pulled her away from the community work entirely. Instead chose a path that allowed teaching, facilitation, and continued learning to coexist. And this decision confused some mentors who equated success with singular focus. But Alina felt clear that her identity was not meant to narrow, and Victor supported her choice by ensuring the programs remained flexible and did not depend solely on her availability. And this intentional redundancy protected both her well-being and the work itself. And during this period, Victor began documenting his experiences more personally, not as a memoir of achievement, but as reflections on unlearning. And he wrote about how meeting Alina disrupted assumptions he did not know he carried, and how power softened when it listened. And he shared drafts with a small circle, including Alina, who offered feedback with honesty and care. And she encouraged him to focus less on himself and more on the questions the journey raised. And Victor embraced this suggestion, revising his writing to center moments of doubt rather than resolution. And this approach made the work less polished but more human. And when excerpts were later shared in small forums, they sparked thoughtful discussion rather than admiration, and this outcome aligned with Victor's values. And Alina noticed that younger facilitators often cited these reflections as permission to question authority, including their own. And she saw how narratives could shape culture without instruction. And as time went on, the original piano tune became less frequently referenced directly, yet its influence remained embedded in practices that valued exploration over completion. And some groups developed their own foundational pieces drawn from local songs, family memories, or improvised sound. And Alina encouraged this evolution because it affirmed that the work was not about preserving an origin story, but about cultivating conditions for expression. And Victor likewise redirected funding to support locally generated ideas rather than scaling a single model. And this distributed approach reduced efficiency but increased relevance. And when external evaluators questioned the lack of uniform outcomes, Victor responded that coherence came from shared values, not identical results. And while this explanation did not satisfy all stakeholders, it attracted those aligned with the philosophy, and gradually a network formed not through branding, but through relationships and trust. And Alina found herself traveling occasionally to support new facilitators, not as an expert, but as a listener. And she approached each context with curiosity, asking what people needed rather than what they should do. And this posture built rapport and prevented replication from becoming rigid. And Victor accompanied her on some visits, but often chose to stay in the background, observing how leadership could be exercised through restraint. And he took note of how his presence sometimes altered dynamics, even unintentionally. And he learned to step away when necessary, and this self-awareness marked one of his most significant personal shifts. And Alina appreciated this sensitivity because it protected the spaces they valued from hierarchy. And as both reflected on the journey, they acknowledged moments of misstep and fatigue and times when progress stalled and frustration surfaced. And they spoke openly about these experiences in trusted circles, emphasizing that sustainability required honesty about limits and rest. And Alina, in particular, advocated for pacing, reminding others that urgency often mirrored the same pressures they sought to escape. And Victor supported this by modeling boundaries and encouraging sabbaticals for facilitators. And this emphasis on care extended the life of the work and prevented burnout. And as the network matured, some participants began applying the listening-based approach to fields beyond music, including education, mediation, and organizational development. And while Alina and Victor did not position the work as a universal solution, they welcomed these adaptations as evidence that the underlying principles resonated. and they remained cautious about claims of impact, preferring to let stories speak individually, and over time the initial amazement that once surrounded the Waitress and the Billionaire faded, almost entirely replaced by quieter recognition of collective effort, and Alina felt relief in this anonymity, because it allowed her to move through spaces without expectation, and Victor likewise found freedom in no longer being seen as the sole driver of change, and both understood that this invisibility was not loss but maturation. And in a reflective conversation, they acknowledged that the most meaningful outcome was not the programs themselves, but the shift in how they related to uncertainty and to others, and they recognized that the original moment at the piano had simply revealed a capacity for listening that already existed, and that the real work was choosing to act on it repeatedly. And as they looked ahead, they did not speak of expansion or legacy, but of stewardship and care, and this orientation guided decisions with patience and humility, and Alina continued to play music not as a performer, but as a participant in shared spaces, and Victor continued to support initiatives quietly without seeking attribution. And together they remained attentive to the evolving needs of the communities they were part of, understanding that relevance required continual listening and adaptation. And this sustained commitment marked the later phase of their journey, where purpose was measured not by growth or recognition, but by integrity and presence. And through this lens, the story that began with a single tune resolved not into an ending, but into an ongoing practice of listening that extended beyond them and into the lives of many who would never know their names yet carry forward the same values in their own ways. And if any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without them in the later years, Alina and Victor rarely spoke about the moment that first brought them together, because it no longer felt like a beginning or a miracle, but simply a point of recognition. And when they did reflect, it was with gratitude rather than pride, and Alina continued to live modestly, choosing a life that allowed time for listening, teaching, and rest. And she never sought a public career, yet her influence traveled quietly through people she had supported and trusted. And some of them went on to create spaces of their own, shaped by the same values of openness, patience, and care, and Alina felt content, knowing she did not need to oversee or approve these paths, because ownership belonged to those living them. And she still returned to the restaurant occasionally to help during busy evenings, not out of necessity but affection. And the familiar sounds and routines reminded her that meaning existed in ordinary moments. And Victor, as he aged, gradually stepped back from active leadership, transferring resources and decision-making to independent groups, and he focused on mentoring a small number of leaders who showed humility and curiosity, and he spoke openly with them about his mistakes, emphasizing that learning often began when certainty was questioned. And he found peace in this quieter role because it aligned with the lessons he learned through listening rather than control. And when his health declined, he prepared carefully, ensuring the work would continue without disruption. And without his name attached, and this intentional release was one of his final acts of leadership. And Alina visited him during this time, symbol or collaborator, but as a friend, and they spoke about simple things, memories, people they admired, and the comfort of shared silence. And Victor expressed that meeting her changed how he understood success. And Alina replied that being heard changed how she understood her own worth. And neither felt the need to say more. And after Victor passed, the news was acknowledged respectfully but without spectacle, and the programs continued unchanged, honoring his wishes. And Alina attended a small gathering where people shared stories not about Victor alone, but about moments when they felt truly listened to, and she realized then that the true legacy was relational rather than institutional. And as time went on, the origin story faded further, yet the practice of listening endured, carried forward by people who had never met either of them. And Alina found quiet fulfillment in knowing that the tune which once amazed a room had become a reminder that wisdom often arrives softly and waits for openness rather than recognition. And she continued to play occasionally, not to complete anything, but to stay connected. And through this ongoing practice, the story found its resolution not in applause or closure, but in continuity and care, and in the understanding that some of the most meaningful changes begin when someone unexpected is trusted and allowed to speak, and when another chooses to listen and let that listening reshape how they move through the world. And this enduring truth remained alive long after names and moments were forgotten, guiding countless small interactions that together formed a more humane way of being. And that was enough. That was enough.